When dealing with mitigation of risks related to natural hazards, specialists have to face the reality of the land use planners. Land use planners are in charge of guiding the development of a territory, considering optimal solutions, stakeholders' interest, geographical, social, economic, and ecological constraints, and, of course, the legislative framework. Within this video, I would like to introduce you to the main definition of land use planning and show you different approaches to land use planning processes. Finally, I will explain you the generic approach applied in Switzerland. Here is the definition of land use planning according to UN-ISDR. What should be highlighted in this definition are the economic, social, and environmental aspects, as well as the involvement of different communities and interest groups in the process. The Swiss approach places land use planning above a technical flow stream of hazard mitigation. What I mean by this is that specialists and engineers that deal with these technical aspects in the main flow stream, as you can see here, where you find hazard mapping, risk assessment, structural measures, etc., will have to discuss with different stakeholders at a planning level. This is the level where balancing of interest between stakeholders will happen. In comparison with the Swiss approach, the French approach considers land use planning as an individual step. I will now present the Swiss approach. As showed in the previous flow streams, the first step is always hazard mapping. The necessary working steps to establish a hazard map are data collection, field preparation and field work, and data transcription and analysis. A map of phenomena and an intensity map are needed to generate a hazard map. The work starts in the office by collecting data and defining scientific and project management procedures to be used. According to my experience, the exchange with other colleagues is not to be underestimated. Their experience often brings a significant added value. Before starting the data collection, you have to be clear about which data you specifically need. You should then ask yourself what quality, what resolution, and at what frequency the data should be updated. In most cases, you will have to use what is available. But be careful, not everything that is available is useful. By the way, do you all know what data on natural hazards are available in your country? Why don't you check and write it in our forum? It would help us understand your situation. Before going to the field and having in mind which data are needed, it is also important to establish procedures in order to be sure that the collected data can later be analyzed. Fieldwork should be organized beforehand. What should be considered? The organization and logistics that it entails, the site accessibility, the environmental context and seasonal variations, as well as weather conditions and vegetation cover. Do not underestimate the field conditions. These pictures show the conditions you could find. Steep slopes, dangerous and challenging environment with unstable terrain or strong water flows. Do not forget that hazard mapping can be a risk in itself. Think about the security procedures when going to the field. Back to the office, the data treatment begins. Specific hazard maps are layered in a GIS program. One layer for landslide, one for floods, etc. The hazard mapping is now completed. We can now present the results and discuss land use planning implementation with stakeholders and/or start assessing the risk. You have here the Swiss definition of risk. Based on hazard mapping, the risk can be calculated as the monetary value of the damage or the number of fatalities. This is a function of events potential times the damages potential. Those values can come from insurance policies, for example. Once the risk is known, you have to decide how to manage the risk. The Swiss strategy entails that risks are part of the land use management through the maintenance of the recommended level of security for all natural hazards. Here is a sketch that illustrates this strategy. Protection goals need to be defined. This is where the interests of stakeholders will be weighted against each other to define the protection goal level. I will talk more about this further. If the risk is higher than the protection goals, as shown in the picture, actions are taken to lower the risk. The achieved security level is now the one you want to maintain and guarantee over the long term. Note that after the integrated action planning, the achieved security level is always the same or below protection goals. Stakeholders, that is to say, authorities, owners, site managers, site operators, urban planners, natural hazard specialists, should be involved to define the best adapted land use planning solution. To what extent should decision makers engage in the avoidance and reduction of risk? Which risks are risk carriers willing to accept? Which risks does the community expect the risk carriers to accept? How can illegitimate risk transfers to be avoided? Public authorities are a key contributor to risk avoidance and risk mitigation. They should make use of land use planning as an instrument to avoid new risks. The final decision often lies with authorities, who are asked to be the referee in balancing interests. One has to be aware that decisions will be partially subjective. It is impossible to set a hazard level that would be universally applied to define if building is safe or not. A country has to take into account all these aspects: demography, economy and finance, social cultural perception, types of hazards and risks, and insurances. For example, Japan will have a completely different challenge with the high risks of earthquakes than Bangladesh with flooding or Nepal with landslides. Demographical development is a key aspect. With increasing urbanization, risk exposures can evolve quickly. The main reason for the shift from centralized to decentralized organization is that local scale are more efficient in dealing with tasks related to risk and emergency management. The Swiss approach is based on local context, regional or national, and on the identified risks. Decisions are taken at decentralized level. We want natural hazard mitigation to be integrated in the routine approach to land use planning. Land use planning is a complex procedure encompassing many steps in which one of them is natural hazards. Part of the work of natural hazard specialists is therefore to make data available and explain the context to land use planning specialists in an understandable way. This procedure chart has been established to accompany the hazard mitigation procedure in the Swiss state where EPFL lays. You will find the official version in the reference documents of this training. What I would like you to note is that the land use planning actions are taken at the beginning of the process. If land use planning is not sufficient to mitigate risks, then organizational, passive, and active measures will be taken. The key messages that I would like you to remember about land use planning is that it is the first action for the mitigation of risks related to natural hazards. However, the approach has to be based on local conditions. This is why the priority should be given to decentralized analysis of the situation. Therefore, there is no universal approach to land use planning. This presentation can be summarized in these two golden rules. What is important to remember is that data analysis and hazard mapping come first, and that non-structural measures should be implemented before structural measures. Thank you for watching.